Hello, welcome to this meeting today. This is a series about Bible studies that we are going to start this today. Everything is going to be about Bible and English. And this is part of a thing that we are doing at this Capítulo 29 church here in Granada. And we are going to start after the pandemic, this thing that we are living now, a biblical principle for lifestyle recovery for 10 Bible studies that Iain is gonna lead us today. So we're gonna have time to hear him, like 20 minutes, 25 minutes. He's gonna read about Deuteronomy 8. He's gonna read about that. And then of that, we are gonna have a time or a small group to speak about this, to discuss about this, and then come back and see that together. So I know nobody can speak about just me because I'm the host today. So this is gonna be like that. I'm gonna leave the time to Iain, and everybody gonna be mute because this is gonna be easier to everybody. So don't bother to try to put your your microphone on because it's not gonna happen. But thank you for seeing this today. This is gonna be in YouTube. In our YouTube channel, C29 Granada. This is gonna be in our Spotify and our everything podcast, so you can hear that more again. So thank you for hearing this today or in whatever time you're listening. And we are about to start. I'm gonna give all this to Iain. Iain, thank you for being here today. And I'm just putting your microphone on and you can introduce yourself and start this marvelous time together. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Esther, and hello to everybody. A few more have joined us just in the last minute or so. And as Esther says, this is going to be the first of a small series of studies that we're going to take with the overall title of After the Pandemic, Biblical Principles for Lifestyle Renewal or Recovery. So I'm going to, in this first session, I'm going to try and explain what all of that means and what I hope we can try to cover in these next few weeks. I think the other thing, just to emphasize the fact, is that I know it's a weekday. So we're going to try and keep this certainly within 1 hour so that we're not running long and people have time to do other things. So I'm going to start off by talking for about 20-25 minutes and then, kind of depending on how many we are, Esther will divide us up into some smaller groups of 4, 5 or 6. And I'm going to suggest some questions that we might use just to sort of share some feelings about the present and the future as we're thinking about it. And then we'll see about coming back to the end of that, or it may be just better for somebody in the small group to close with a prayer, and then we can leave the meeting. The other thing that I've asked Esther to do is just to make sure that I've got my phone number and email on the chat screen that will be available to everybody, basically because I'm keen to sort of hear back from everybody. We're going to be talking about a whole lot of things that perhaps we don't usually talk about. Some of them I hope are going to be controversial. And so I'm keen to have questions, comments, ideas, criticisms from people so that we can collect them together. Sometimes I will respond directly to you. Quite a lot of the time we'll just take the ideas or the questions and use them in one of the subsequent meetings that we have. The other final thing, just for communication, is simply, I know this is in English, and for some of you, English is not your first language, so please let me know, either directly or get somebody else to tell me, if I'm actually speaking too fast or if I'm using language that is just too complicated or whatever. I try to keep it steady and straightforward language. So, like many of you, Rita Lisa, my wife, and I have been spending time these past couple of days studying the government's proposals for the different phases of the planned return to what we hope is going to be a much more normal life for us here in Spain. We've also been studying the graphs showing the progress of the control of the pandemic, particularly in Granada, hoping that we're going to be one of the provinces that gets to phase 1 as soon as possible, or perhaps on May the 11th. And I guess most of you, and I think just from conversations we had a moment ago, it's obvious that everybody's been doing exactly the same. We want to know about getting back to work, which shops we can go to, how much exercise we can take, what we can do with the children. And of course, we're all wondering at what stage we're going to be able to get back together as a church. These past 6 weeks have been very difficult for many of us. We've experienced fear about infection, illness, and the possibility of death, perhaps for ourselves, certainly for older members of our families. We've all had to work out how to get food and essential supplies. Some of us have been living alone, and that's been a real struggle with loneliness. We've all had to work out how to manage the use of our time. Some of our church members have been on the front lines in health and security, and we're really proud of the work that they've been doing and grateful for them. But most of us have also been affected by the economic shutdown in some way or another. I'm sure some of us have been very anxiously following week by week the announcements from the government about what they're going to do for employees, for small businesses, for autonomos, different groups. We all have our particular interest groups. We've been waiting to see what sort of support we've been going to get. And certainly for those who amongst our group have been dependent on the tourist industry, this has been quite a calamity. And there's still a lot of uncertainty about when it's all going to pick up, let alone when it's going to reach the sort of level of maturity that we enjoyed before the epidemic. And as in this present meeting, we've all enjoyed Zoom, but boys, are we looking forward to being able to get back together and give each other a hug on a Sunday evening celebration. A few weeks ago, I found a very thoughtful article by a man called Andy Crouch and 2 colleagues who have an organization in the United States that supports Christian entrepreneurs. And they were really just talking and giving some advice about how to think about the future to the various clients that they have. And they were suggesting that we need to think about this time of the lockdown as a blizzard, a really severe snowstorm. It describes the time of most intense disruption of our normal way of life. It's the time when increasing numbers of people have been infected and some have died. They then suggested that there's a second period, maybe of a few months, during which the pandemic is first brought under control, and then we see the restrictions on daily life and business gradually relaxed, and we return to some semblance of normality. That's the period that we're in at the moment. And they suggested we should think about this as the season of winter. So first blizzard and then winter. Finally, they urged their readers to recognize that it'll be a matter of probably at least 18 months and probably more before any semblance of real normality is restored to our economy. This period they called the Little Ice Age. Blizzard, winter, Little Ice Age. Obviously in Spain, these are perhaps not the most familiar metaphors to choose, but I think we can all imagine what they mean. In a blizzard, you have to get the shelter, food and drink, make yourself as warm as possible and wait for it to blow over. Winter's a time when activities and supplies are limited, It's an opportunity to prepare for the next spring and summer. But an ice age has to be very different. It affects the types of agriculture and economy, and their productivity has many follow-on effects on all aspects of our culture and ways of life. Perhaps the most recent situation that was similar was the 2008 crisis. Certainly the blizzard at that time was nothing like as dramatic as our current pandemic. But I think we can immediately recognize the idea of the winter and the ice age that followed that crisis. For many people, the lack of employment opportunities and the difficulties in setting up small businesses would indicate that that particular ice age maybe never actually ended. At this point, I want to introduce a question for us all to think about. After this is all over, do you want us to just go back to the situation that we had before the pandemic struck? Or maybe I could rephrase the question. Do you think it's possible for us all to go back to the situation before the pandemic? Hopefully, we'll have an effective vaccine before too long, but as a society, we have lessons to learn about being prepared for pandemics and how to prevent them. We hope that the economy will recover, but do we want it to be the same sort of economy that creates winners and losers that we had before? Can we afford the same economy that is based on constant economic growth and consumption? And has everybody forgotten about the climate crisis? Even though the skies have been clearer during this time, the problem has not gone away. During the pandemic, the oil and coal industries have crashed because of reduced demand. Now, during the recovery period, we and our governments have to make the policy decisions and, for ourselves, maybe the lifestyle changes required to create a healthier world. For us as Christians, I believe that the additional question is whether the Bible teaches us to have maybe a special way of thinking about all of these things. And if it does, can we discover what that special way of thinking looks like? Obviously, the Bible doesn't talk anything at all about blizzards and ice ages, but it does refer to winter in several places. However, ever since Felicia gave us her talk on silence, solitude, and deserts on Easter Saturday evening, I've been thinking more and more about deserts. And certainly there's quite a lot about deserts in the Bible. And I'd like us to go back to the story of the Exodus. And I'd like to get you to use the idea of the blizzard, the winter, and the ice age, and just see how that maybe applies to the experience of the children of Israel as they went through the Exodus from Egypt, all that happened in and around Mount Sinai, and then the 40 years of being led by God in the desert before they finally crossed the Jordan River and into the Promised Land. First then, the actual Exodus story. The Israelites were slaves in Egypt. This is a familiar story to us all, I think, but let me just walk us through it again. The Israelites were slaves in Egypt, and Moses demands from Pharaoh that he let the Israelites leave to worship God in the desert. Instead of letting them go, Pharaoh makes their work harder. Then there's the series of increasingly devastating plagues that come on the land of Egypt and its people. Still, Pharaoh doesn't budge. He would only change his mind after the final plague, when the firstborn male children of the Egyptians and all their livestock were killed in one night. Pharaoh's own son was one of the victims. That was the night of Passover, and each of the families of the Israelites had killed a lamb to be eaten that night, and the blood was painted on the doorposts of the entrance to their houses, so that when the angel of death saw the blood on the doorposts, he passed over that house. The next morning, all of the Israelites left Egypt. A few days later, they crossed over the Red Sea on dry land because God had sent a wind to hold back the waters. Meanwhile, the Egyptian chariots and army were chasing after them, and as they went into the passage between the water fell back and drowned them all. That whole experience was as dramatic and scary as any blizzard. The next 2 or 3 months were a bit like the season of winter. It was a time of preparation. They were in a desert. They were traveling to Mount Sinai, where God had told Moses that he would meet with his people. After that, they would continue on to Canaan, the land that God had promised to Abraham, their ancestor. Quite soon after crossing the Red Sea, they ran out of food, and the people complained. God provided the manna every day after that for them to eat. They didn't have water, and again they complained, and God provided water. They complained that back in Egypt they'd had plenty of meat to eat, but here they had none. God was getting angry because they were always complaining, but he gave them the quail to eat. At Mount Sinai, there was the drama of fire and cloud on top of the mountain. It was here that God renewed his covenant with Israel. He gave the 10 Commandments and the rest of the law to Moses. God gave instructions, and the tabernacle, the special tent where God would meet with his people, was made. But this was also the time when the people persuaded Moses' brother Aaron to make the golden calf as an image of the Lord. The sacrifices were followed by a party, an orgy in fact, and God then destroyed all those who had taken part. At the border with Canaan, at a place called Kadesh Barnea, 12 spies were sent to explore Canaan and to come back and report what they found. They all came back saying what an amazing place it was, a land flowing with milk and honey. But most of them said, the people are really fierce, and they're big, and they've got walled cities that we would never be able to take. Only 2 of the spies, Caleb and Joshua, disagreed with them. And they tried to persuade the people that God had promised them this land. They reminded them that only a few weeks before that God had defeated the Egyptians, the strongest power in the whole region at that time. He would certainly be able to give them the land. But the people said, no, we're not going in. And God understandably was very angry. And he said that none of the people 20 years and older would ever go into the land that he'd promised them. After a while, they left Kadesh Barnea. They spent the next 40 years in the desert. God still fed them and provided all that they needed. But it was a time when they had to learn many lessons about God. I think we can perhaps think of this as their little ice age. The blizzard of the Exodus, the season of winter, around of the period of preparation around Mount Sinai, and then after the refusal to go into the land, the period of the little ice age, wandering in the desert. Eventually, the time came for the Israelites to enter the promised land. God had brought them to the east bank of the River Jordan. They would need to cross over the Jordan, but only Caleb and Joshua, out of all of those who were 20 years or older at Kadesh Barnea, would be going over. Only those 2. Not even Moses, because he had dishonored God by losing his temper. But before he died, Moses spent some time reminding the people of all of the things that God had told him at Mount Sinai 40 years before. I think he must have done it over several meetings with the people, because what he said is all of what's actually recorded for us in the book of Deuteronomy. with all of its 34 chapters. But the words that I want us to focus on today are found in chapter 8 of the book of Deuteronomy. And I think the words are coming up on the chat screen if you want to follow them there. I'm reading this from the NIV version. And God says through Moses, "Be careful to follow every command I am giving you today, so that you may live and increase and may enter and possess the land the Lord promised on oath to your ancestors. Remember how the Lord your God led you all of the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, and that was to teach you that man does not live by bread alone, but in every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothes didn't wear out and your feet didn't swell during those 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, so the Lord your God disciplines you. Observe the commands of the Lord your God, walking in obedience to him and revering him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with brooks, streams, and deep springs gushing out into the valleys and hills, a land with wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil and honey, a land where bread will not be scarce and you will lack nothing, a land where the rocks are iron and you can dig copper out of the hills. When you've eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws, and his decrees that I am giving you this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, when your herds and flocks grow large and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. He led you through the vast and dreadful wilderness, that thirsty and waterless land, with its venomous snakes and scorpions. He brought you water out of hard rock. He gave you manna to eat in the wilderness, something your ancestors had never known, to humble and test you, so that in the end it might go well with you. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth. And so he confirms his covenant, which he swore to your ancestors, as it remains to today. If you ever forget the Lord your God and follow other gods and worship and bow down to them, I testify against you today that you will surely be destroyed. Like the nations, the Lord destroyed before you, so you will be destroyed for not obeying the Lord your God. It's the whole of chapter 8 of Deuteronomy. And I wonder, can there be really any doubt about the point that God is trying to make to his people? He starts off in verse 1, be careful to follow every command I am giving you today, so that you may live and increase and may enter and possess the land the Lord promised on oath to your ancestors. I suspect there are two ways of understanding what God is saying here. The first one basically goes like this. If you're good boys and girls, I will reward you with some presents that you will like. In this sort of way, God asks his people to live pure and holy lives and to worship him. And as a reward, he gives them security and prosperity. But other than there being a reward, there may be no real particular connection between the laws we obey and what we actually receive from God. If you're good boys and girls, I'll give you a present. The second possible way of understanding God's words here is as follows. If you follow the book of instructions carefully, you will enjoy the full potential of this thing that I'm giving you. I.e., if somebody gives you a new drone or a sewing machine, it's clear that getting the best out of them depends on following the instructions as accurately and as fully as possible. So, which is it? What did God mean when he spoke to his people about his commands? Just a reward for being generally good? Or was it about using the instruction manual to get the best out of life? We're going to be looking at quite a lot of the Old Testament laws in the next few studies. And when we begin to study these actual laws that God gave to Israel, we're going to discover that a lot of them provide details of the ways in which they are to run their economy and their welfare system. There's also clear family and criminal law. Yes, there are the rules about religious worship and sacrifice, but interestingly, they're usually connected in some way with the laws about the economy. I think, therefore, we're going to see that security and prosperity are directly connected with the laws that God gives about the economy. Secondly, if we go on down to verses 17 and 18 in Deuteronomy 8, we'll read, "You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms his covenant, which he swore to your ancestors." So what does he mean when he says it is God who gives you the ability to produce wealth? Is this some kind of special supernatural gift or magic that transforms people's ability to work their farms or do their crafts or whatever it is? No. The ability that God gives us is the knowledge of God's way of running a good economy. And we're going to see that is an economy that is designed to be what I call a win-win economy for everyone. God's laws and commands are his instruction manual for the good life, the life that he wants us all to enjoy to the fullest. So during these next few studies, I want us to look at God's commands and laws to try to discover what that instruction manual looks like. Of course, it's very obvious that the world in which we live today is hugely different from the economy of the Israelite people 3,000 years ago. But before we dismiss that, let's also remember, too, that the world of the Roman Empire in the time of Christ and the early church was also very different, both from ours, but also from the earlier culture. And Jesus said at the beginning of his Sermon on the Mount, he said, "Don't think that I've come to abolish the law of the prophets. I haven't come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. but whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. We're going to have to work out exactly what that means for us today. But we're going to look at some of these laws in the Old Testament, and we're going to try and understand the purpose and intention behind them. I hope in that way that we can begin to understand and discover principles that we can then seek to apply in our contemporary situation. And along the way, we'll also take a look in the New Testament and see the way in which Jesus and the early church applied these same rules to that situation that they had. So, when we talk about the economy, I think we're going to need to discuss what we mean when we talk about the good life. We need to talk about consumer society and the meaning of contentment. I think we need to talk about maybe the difficult aspect of the win-lose aspect of contemporary capitalism, and think about whether there is a possible win-win economy of good neighbors that is described in the Bible. When we think about the poor and the needy, the widow and the orphan, again, we need to work out who should care for them and how should it be done? Who pays for it? Who does the actual work? We're also going to need to talk about the earth, our environment, the crisis of climate and our responsibility for it. Finally, what I want us to be all the time thinking about is, what is a special role, if any, that the church and ourselves as individual Christians and groups of Christians should be having in all of this? The Bible has lots of things to say about all of these things. So, first of all, I want us to actually start with the blizzard. And I think it might be helpful for us to talk a bit about the pandemic itself. It's a different sort of issue than talking about the economy and climate change and those sorts of things, but I think we'll realize that looking at that and asking ourselves some questions is going to help us begin to think about some of the other things. I think we need to ask ourselves, what kind of an evil is this pandemic, is this virus? And maybe even who or what is responsible? And I think because some Christian leaders are raising the issue, we should also ask ourselves, is this one of the plagues that God sends from time to time to discipline his people, to humble us, and to draw us to repentance? And if we think that God is doing this, I think the most important question that we need to ask ourselves is, what does repentance actually look like in practice in this sort of a situation? So, the takeaway message for today is in the words of God to his people in Deuteronomy 8. There's verses in verse 1. Be careful to follow every command I am giving you today, so that you may live and increase and may enter and possess the land the Lord promised on oath to your ancestors. We're going to think of it firstly as God's instruction manual for the good life. And that I hope can be the basis for our future studies as we begin to look at a lot of these things. So that's all I want to say. I think I've probably gone over my 25 minutes. I apologize for that. I'll try to do better next time. But Esther, maybe we could break up into a couple of groups at this point. I think we're 11. If we break up into a couple of groups, what I'm going to suggest is that let's just use this time as a time just to reflect a little bit about where we are at this stage in the pandemic and the blizzard, if you will, looking ahead to the period of winter and the period of the little ice age over the next 1 to 2 years that is surely ahead of us. And what I'd like us to, each of us to do, is to ask ourselves, as we think about the future, what are the things that you most look forward to? Secondly, what are the things that make you worry as you look to the future? And then thirdly, what changes in your life or in the world would you like to see? Okay, we don't have a lot of time to really think about that, but maybe we could just take a little time to share some of those ideas together. As much as anything else, I think, you know, this is a time when we just share with each other and realize that we not only have special things that we are looking forward to, but we do have worries and fears, not just in the present, but in the long run. And there are certainly maybe some changes that we would like to see. So let's share those together. And then I think when we've finished that, I suggest that one person in each group might just say a prayer to close that discussion, pray for the people in the group,